Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is...
Corey Colonel Mode. Sorry, I had a blue screen of death. Knock Reiner.
Pretty good. As Corey's hinting at, on today's episode, we will go through CrowdStrike's post-incident report describing the IT security event that took down 8.5 million endpoints last Friday, maybe I guess 2 Fridays ago at the time you're listening to this. We'll then talk about how KnowBe4 hired a North Korean threat actor accidentally. And we will end with a quick research blog from our friends at Wiz. Wiz? It's definitely Wiz. Detailing some research.
It's not Cheese Whiz, by the way, but pronounce it the same.
Was going to be Google Wiz, but that does not appear to be the case anymore. Research into artificial intelligence that they've been doing and which they will be presenting at Black Hat. With that, let's go ahead and whiz our way in.
That could go wrong. cheese whiz our way in this a safer way.
So, Corey, how was your Friday on the 19th?
Yeah, without you when we were doing a podcast, that was fun. Thanks to, but actually, my Friday, while I might have been on the news talking about this, you lived it firsthand, I hear. So both our Fridays were fun, right?
Yeah, I was in Seattle on vacation that week before, and Friday was my day to try and get back home to Austin, Texas. And what started in the morning as, oh man, looks like they're about to have a bad day, turned into, oh man, I'm about to have a bad day, as my flight was luckily only delayed 4 hours. I think I was lucky in that there was this time period on the morning of the 19th.
The incident we're about to talk about.
Yeah, where Delta had all their pilots in the right places. They had all their airplanes in the right places. So that first round of flights made it out. And then the second round of flights did kind of okay. And then it all just went off the rails. And by the time I came back to Seattle on that following Sunday,
it was worse,
was delayed,
right?
7 hours and one of only 10% of flights out of Austin that actually took off from Delta. So yeah, holy crap.
It turns out if you lose almost all your computers and each one needs to be hand touched to recover, you have a bad day of an organization that might get cascadingly worse as the timing.
Exactly. And it turns out even if you bring the critical systems back online relatively quickly, if only 5% of your workforce has working workstations, it becomes really difficult to use that system still effectively. So, man, last Friday, which you already talked about on the last podcast without me, and again, all over the local news here in Seattle, last Friday was nuts from the world of information technology, where
we should say we're talking about CrowdStrike. We literally have not said CrowdStrike yet. We're talking about CrowdStrike again, everyone.
Yes. And now that the dust has settled a little bit for some organizations, the dust is still very much in the air for Delta, despite their CEO arriving in Paris this morning as we're recording. We have at least started to see some of the details from CrowdStrike on what the heck actually happened in this case. And to their credit, they released a very detailed and very transparent post-incident report so far. They're calling it their preliminary one. It's got some high level, but still somewhat detailed information about what happened to cause 8.5 million Windows computers to blue screen and require manual intervention to recover. So because this is the biggest IT incident in the last couple of years, I think it's worth going through and seeing what all of us can learn from what CrowdStrike is disclosed as a part of this incident. Quick background again. On Friday at around 4 in the morning and lasting for about an hour and a half, any Windows machine that was running CrowdStrike's sensor version 7.11 and was connected to a network downloaded a content configuration update that ultimately triggered a Windows blue screen of death system crash. And like we were chatting about at the start of this, Corey, when I got to SeaTac Airport, even the ticket printing machines that Delta uses, the little check-in kiosks, all of them were showing the blue screen of death or recovery. All of the television monitors throughout the airport were showing it, just like the pictures you're showing on the video right now. it was honestly surreal. Just the immediately obvious impact of this incident in across the world.
And
And
that's
it's
one
interesting.
airline. It turned out lots of relatively large organizations were using this product. As you mentioned, the number seems to be 8.5 million endpoints out there. And I think one of the things I may not have done well on the news, because I talked about endpoints like computers or servers, but I think I might have done better in the podcast, is that people don't realize how many kiosk based like your baggage check, even if you've checked in online, your baggage ticket thing, the thing at the airline, your a train monitor telling you to schedule, an ATM machine. There are many devices that modern EPDR or EDR solutions, which is like what CrowdStrike makes and what we make here at WatchGuard, they're meant to be on any device that supports the operating system Windows, Linux, or Mac, because they all need protection. ATMs are being attacked if they're running Windows, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the companies that did use this, you don't really realize the full fallout of something. It's not just your employees' workstations, as you mentioned, although those are a big deal all on their own, and your servers, but it's all these kiosk machines that are the modern conveniences that are operational technology. We don't really, I guess technical people realize they're computers, but a lot of people might think they're purpose built machines, but they're just running Windows and apparently other things.
Yeah, and it was surreal just immediately seeing how many Windows machines had CrowdStrike installed and were connected to the internet to get their updates. It was nuts. So before we go through like CrowdStrike's analysis of what happened, I think there's a few things we probably want to explain for folks that aren't Windows developers or um, nerds like us that keep up to date on things. So real quick, in Windows, and I guess in every operating system, there's a separation between what's called user space and kernel space. Basically, programs that run in user space are given virtual memory allocations, and they aren't able to directly interact with other memory of other processes except through API functions that are exposed either through the operating system itself or a driver. Drivers operate in kernel mode and can see and interact with memory from any process on the entire system. Device drivers, the things that interact directly with hardware, need to run in kernel mode in order to access the hardware itself. So, for example, the driver for your storage disk, the driver for your optical disk, if you've still got a DVD player, all of these need to interact with hardware, so they run in kernel mode. When a user space program crashes, the program itself just crashes and exits. You've probably encountered this several times throughout this year with random browser crashes or random applications that hang. At the end of the day, you lose whatever work was unsaved in that application, but the operating system chugs along just fine. In kernel space programs, when they crash, the entire operating system effectively halts. And on Windows, you get the blue screen of death. On Linux, you get the black screen of death. And on Mac, I think it's like a magenta or something. But it's important because an issue in kernel space that could potentially corrupt memory could affect the memory of any program or every program running on the system, including that underlying OS. That is why a crash in kernel space causes that blue screen of death and halts all execution. Corey, it looked
Yeah,
like you wanted to add something.
I agree. I will. We'll get to why you're talking about this. I will say, by the way, most programs shouldn't really have. There's a lot of people out there that think other than OS makers and very specialized hardware makers like graphic drivers and stuff, normal programs should not have a kernel driver. You shouldn't be mucking around there. But I will say, AV, anti-malware, AV, EDR, whatever you want to call host-based security, host-based security is one of the things that needs an exception. A lot of attacks are happening, like they're specifically rootkits meant to do things at a kernel level instead of a user level to evade certain detections. So being able to load security type things as a kernel driver is pretty important. So this, you might hear programmers talk about, for security operating systems and uptime, you really should avoid kernel space when possible. There's the reason they have a separation of privilege, but I will say security host software having a kernel driver is not unusual. I
Yep.
will get to Mark. I mean, I know why you're talking about this, but this issue wasn't in a kernel driver. I think we have theories about how the binary file might have been loaded by a kernel driver, but those are actually being still argued online. So according right to the blog post we're talking about, is the .sys file in question is not a kernel driver, but I assume you're talking about this mostly because we suspect, they talk about what update caused the issue and that we're going to get into, but we suspect it might have to do with how that particular update is loaded by a kernel driver, right?
Yep, we'll get to that. They
Yeah.
actually describe exactly how it interacted with their kernel driver. So to your point, though, endpoint security products need to see all memory on a system to look for rootkits or just malicious programs or even legitimate programs that have been compromised and behaving unexpectedly. On Windows, you can do that through a kernel driver. On other operating systems like Mac OS, you actually interact through APIs that Mac exposes. Mac does not allow third-party kernel drivers. And that is a security trade-off in that if whatever you're trying to monitor isn't accessible by that API, it is hidden from the endpoint protection.
Yeah.
So it's not a
It's very
totally
good and
black and white
bad, and it's
scenario.
up for debate. I forget who my favorite Mac researcher is. He talks at every DEF CON, but the good thing is they at least are starting to expose some of it via APIs, so they're giving a more secure way to look at it. But the guy I'm thinking of, complains all the time that there's certain things that their API is not allowing access to, and it is limiting security programs. It's limiting detection of some of the hacks he finds. So they're doing it for a secure reason, but then they're also obfuscating external security software from being able to help you.
Yep. So on Windows, there's an entire program, they call it the Windows Hardware Quality Labs, or WHQL, that's designed to let driver developers test their drivers, put it through certifications, make sure that it basically doesn't break anything on Windows. And then at the end of it, Windows cryptographically signs basically their stamp of approval on that driver to say this is certified to work with X version of Windows operating system. Now, that program, it takes time to go through it. You have to do the tests, you have to submit it for being signed by Windows. So it's not something you can really do on a rapid, frequent basis that you might need for endpoint protection. Because any changes to the driver code itself, any modification has to go through that certification process again, be tested, be certified, signed, and then you can deploy it. So with endpoint security, evolving threats change every day, and you need to stay up to date on whatever the latest techniques and tactics the threat actors are using. And being forced to wait several weeks potentially to go through the certification process would make it extremely difficult to handle evolving threats. Some vendors handle this in different ways. I'd say WatchGuard handles it differently than CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike handles it differently than Bitdefender or Sentinel-1.
Sentinel-1.
Everyone's got their own ways to be able to deliver fast updates. And in this case, we'll talk about CrowdStrike's because that is where this issue arose. So, quick primer that CrowdStrike gave in their blog post is how they deliver content to their EDR tool. So CrowdStrike uses packages that they call sensor content to identify adversarial activity. In their report, they said the sensor content packages can include things like a machine learning model or executable code that let them reuse capabilities by more rapid response content that we'll talk about in a second. They talk about this concept of a template type, which is basically a predefined bit of code that they can instantiate into specific detections later on. The template type, it's got predefined fields for threat detection engineers that lets them write template instances to combat specific threats. So sensor content, including the template types, are a part of the driver. They go through extensive QA process that includes testing, fuzzing, manual automated testing, validation, and a staged rollout. And that's available to CrowdStrike customers either as the latest release, N-1 or N-2.
Can I put this censored content in basically dummy speak, or at least this type of update? And this feels more like a full sensor update. Like if you are getting a point release of the agent, whether you're calling it a sensor, an agent, whatever the application is, this is a normal full release. So this is the kind of thing that happens at best monthly, maybe even quarterly. And you'll talk about how this is fully tested. But to your point, what we're getting to is the other one, which is just think of them as the the everyday, at least daily, if not hourly updates that you have to keep rules, behaviors, detections. It's a constant cat and mouse. So, like Mark was saying, there's types of updates endpoint software needs that have to happen regularly. But this first one, if it were a full agent update, this is what would happen. This wasn't a full agent update. This was more about one of the more daily, hourly updates, right?
Yep.
Which
So
we'll get to.
sensor content, what they call it, that is a part of the driver that goes through all of the testing and validation and fuzzing, the certification, and it's rolled out in a controllable manner by users on a, like you said, monthly basis potentially. CrowdStrike also releases what they call rapid response content, which is stored as just a binary file. It's proprietary, and it contains configuration data. So not executable code. That's the sensor content packages. This is the configuration files that tell that executable code what to do in order to catch or evaluate or monitor a specific type of threat. So they, in their blog post, they specifically said that this rapid release content is not code and it's not a kernel driver. It's delivered as what they call template instances, which are instantiations of a template type and map specific behaviors for that sensor to observe, detect, block, whatever. They deliver these rapid response contents regularly, sometimes multiple times a day. And they are delivered as .sys files, but like you pointed out, they are specifically not a driver, even though they use a .sys file extension.
The reason we point this out is there's a lot of analysis online trying to smartly reverse like the memory condition that caused this, although there's a well-known post, but then another post that shows a very different situation. But a lot of people assumed because it was a .sys, it was a kernel driver, and they were wondered why half of it was zeroed out. It's because it's not. It does contain instructions to do something, which Mark will get to. But there's a lot of people trying to technically reverse this, and I've already seen some competing answers.
Yep. So it's not executable code. It's a configuration file that tells a instance of that driver or code what to do. So CrowdStrike, they deliver these rapid response content updates regularly, sometimes even multiple times a day. New template types, the executable driver code itself. So remember, this is a template instance versus a template type. The template types are stress tested against what they say, quote, any possible value of the associated data. Template instances, the rapid response content, however, only go through a content validator that performs validation checks on the content itself before it's published. So this is, I think, a place to pause and get into exactly what they're saying here. So like the driver updates, the template types, they're dynamically tested. They obviously do some code checks themselves. They probably have a static application security testing tool, but they also put it through deployment stages, make sure that it doesn't break on certain versions of Windows. These configuration files, the template instances, they run just a static check against them to say, okay, for this field, is this value allowed? Yes. Okay, then continue on. And assuming everything is green, then they can go push it out into production.
Maybe they'll get into this in the timeline, but to like translate it, just the way you described it to me too, this is kind of the crux of the problem, in that, like us, for the full agent release, they might have a full set of tests, internal beta, early adopter beta, and staged rollout. For these kind of updates, it seems like it's blasted to everyone if it passes this validation. So if that validation misses anything, it happens. It still goes to everyone.
Yep. So here's the timeline that they gave. In February of 2024, they released sensor version 7.11, which included a brand new template type, so executable driver code. They pushed it in their staging environment and then pushed it out to production. This new template type, it was designed to detect attack techniques that abuse named pipes, so like inter-process communication. Throughout the blog, they call it the IPC template type. So if you read it yourselves, that's what they're talking about. So that was February 2024, the new sensor version. They now have this new template type, so executable code that they can use. On March 5th, 2024, so the next month, they ran their stress test against that new template type in their staging environment. and containing a bunch of different operating systems, and it passed that stress test. So this code was already in there. They weren't actively using it. They didn't have any configuration files that instantiated this, but it was in there. And then they tested it a month later, and those tests came back, okay, we're ready to start using this. So on March 5th, also that same day, after that successful stress test, they released their first template instance for the new template type. So basically, they tested the configuration file through their battery of tests. This configuration file and the brand new template type passed, so they released it to production. The next month, in April, they released 2 additional template instances. Got to make sure we get that
Their wording right.
Absolutely correct. On April 8th and April 24th for that new template type, and both of those worked without issues. So now, end of April, we've got the new code, the template type, and we have 3 configurations, the template instances, that are all working without problems. The first one went through the battery of stress tests. They think that they're home and clear.
And so to make sure I'm understanding right, and maybe the audience, this testing is of these template types, but originally they weren't actually testing rules that would go to those template types. But when they got to the stress testing and this one, the channel file they talk about, that is that is the content
that's
rule. So at least go ahead.
That's the template instance. Their channel files are the configuration file.
Yeah. So they're starting to test the types of things they're sending to the templates on an ongoing basis.
So now fast forward to July 19th. They had 2 additional template instances that they wanted to deploy out. So these are the configuration files for this code in the driver. They can execute and look for things. Both of them passed their validation tests. So they ran their static validation tool against them to make sure the values in these configuration files were okay. Both passed, but unfortunately, there's a bug in the validation where technically one of those instant types should not have passed validation. And so here's where the meat of the issue comes in. And they've got a quote here that said, based on the testing performed before the initial deployment of the template type in March, our trust in the checks performed in the content validator and previous successful IPC template instance deployments, these instances were deployed into production. So basically, because they test the code itself, the driver bit, because they believed that their validation for these configuration files was okay, and because they hadn't had a problem yet, even including in their stress test, they pushed them straight to production, and where they became active. And when that sensor, when it was received by the sensor and loaded into the content interpreter, the problematic content in channel file 291 resulted in an out-of-bounds memory read, triggering an exception. The unexpected exception could not be gracefully handled, resulting in a Windows operating system crash, the blue screen of death. So it's interesting. So this boils down to there was a bug in their driver that this configuration triggered.
Yeah.
And their earlier testing didn't find that bug for whatever reason. And it was only when this kind of faulty config got pushed that it triggered the bug and caused the crash.
And technically, this is a driver that's only getting updated, not on these rapid response things. That driver is probably part of their sensor content.
It's been there since February. Yep.
It's just a driver bug that none of their other testing caught, and it wasn't until their rapid response, this particular template instance update hit it that the bug showed itself. But the weird thing is, it's the fact that their detection updates are triggering bugs in the main sensor product was the big deal, and the main product really needs QA testing at a much wider level, but the content updates are not going to get that level of testing. So you really need somehow to have good validation so that you're not triggering sensor bugs.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, in theory, like, their stress testing should have found this. Like, we don't know exactly what was in that content configuration file, the template instance. We don't know, like, was it a field that was left empty? And because it was left empty, it triggered this bug in the driver. But if their stress testing was as thorough as they hoped it would, in theory, should have caught this issue. But so it's It's interesting because the spirit of like the Windows driver program is supposed to be anything that could be a meaningful code change to a driver should go through validation again and get recertified. And that isn't really compatible with how endpoint security needs to work with rapid iterations. And so this is kind of like skirting the spirit of that program where these config files clearly can impact the driver and trigger a
Yeah.
kernel level
The
issue on the
question
system.
is, is it a sneaky way that they're literally changing the code of the driver, or is the driver actually remaining unchanged, but it has a parsing error that when it parses whatever the code is, it's running into a bug that just wasn't caught? So I get they could be bypassing the spirit of it, but I'm still not sure that binary.sys file, however they're obviously delivering behavior updates to a driver, but is the driver parsing it as a rule without adjusting its code, or is the driver code somehow being patched as part of the update? You know what I mean?
And I
And
think
to
it's
me, that
probably
makes
the former. It doesn't sound like they're updating the driver code. It sounds like it went to load this basically configuration file and then just
uh,
crapped out while trying to load the config.
So to some extent, I feel like there may not be, because it's the driver itself that they shouldn't update without the process. And I think all drivers need to be able to parse code. So this could also be described as a very hard to find bug in the driver. Like the driver not only passed their processes, it passed Microsoft's processes. And by the way, I'm not forget. I'm sure they have learned from this, and they'll update their testing process to find this. No matter what, they should learn and update from this. I'm just saying. I think we've experienced enough bugs that sometimes you get things that aren't simple memory overflows and aren't simply triggered, null pointers are off by one. They're ones that happen in really unique situations that are hard to find. So I get where you're going with the potential. Are they getting past the spirit of Microsoft's kernel driver testing? I'm still, my personal opinion is I'm still open there. I just think they need to figure out how to test these more regular updates better so that they don't trigger relatively hard to find bugs.
Let's talk about that testing real quick. And I'm going to give an example of like how our security team manages our SIM. So we use detection as code. Basically, all of our detection capabilities are managed in individual YAML formatted files that include like the search string that we use in our SIM, metadata about what should be included in the detection if it's triggered, things like that. During deployment, these individual YAML files are converted into just a monolith configuration file for our SIM, which we then load in, and that becomes the new detection suite for it. If there was a formatting issue in our YAML files, that could be translated into an issue in that conf file that would break the whole thing and break all of our detections in that file if our SIM couldn't load that and start working on it. And so to make sure that doesn't happen in our deployment pipeline, we've got static validation for those YAML files as part of the build process that, for example, goes, okay, is the file itself a YAML file? Yes? Okay, check number one passed. Now, for each field, are the values in that field matching up to what we expect for that field? Does it match a regular expression? Does it match a predefined set of like specific low, medium, high, or critical severity and nothing else? And if
So
there's
in other
any issue,
words, that's a form of bounds checking, right? If you're essentially giving input to a function that's doing something with it, you're at least making sure the input you're delivering is within the bounds of something you expect it to be, so that it's not something that would trigger whatever is parsing it to suddenly go crazy.
yeah, so it's a static check of the file
Yeah.
itself before we load it into the configuration file. But like we don't want to rely just on those static checks because by nature it's checking for scenarios that we expect to happen, and we include scenarios that we think we know would break it if it was in there, but we don't know everything that could
However, that
potentially
would
break.
break.
Like
And
every
to your
potential
point,
mistake.
so far we're kind of on par with
Yep.
we're not above their testing, because they did have a static, I forget what they called it, but a static check of this particular
Yep.
content file.
And just making sure I'm clear again, this is like our internal security team talking about our like SIM,
Our
not like
sim, not our
WatchGuard's EDR
product.
product.
Yeah,
But because I don't trust that, or we don't trust that, we aren't going to make a mistake in that YAML file that we didn't think of that would cause that whole thing to break. We don't just push that conf file directly to our production SIM. We first install it in our staging SIM, like our testing SIM. And we make sure that can it load the conf file? Do all of our detections show up as we expect? And can we enable them? Like basically, does anything catastrophically break? And only then do we deploy it to our production instance. That is the step that I think CrowdStrike was missing in here, where even though their configuration, like validation tool returned okay, if they had loaded this into, a Windows 10 or Windows 11 machine running sensor version 11, it sounds like in theory that machine would have immediately blue screened and that would have been a red flag. And because
Yeah,
they
they would
didn't
have known.
push this to
Yeah.
staging first and pushed it straight to prod, that is what caused this issue ultimately.
Yeah, if they just had it on one active machine before they pushed it to everyone, they would have seen it when it actually ran in a dynamic test. By the way, just because you were giving the example of how we check updates in our internal SIM and our SOC, the audience out there probably wants to know a little bit about our endpoint process. Obviously this CrowdStrike thing didn't affect us at all, but I just wanted to point to, if you join the WatchGuard product blog, and you go to our partner blog, Guillermo, our basically head of the endpoint product management, released something that talks about both of our processes too. And by both, I mean the actual full agent update process, which has a very rigorous amount of testing and staging and pre-beta and early adopters and then staging rollout. But we also do go into other things on the update process and the content update process too. So we talk about, for EPDR and AD360, what types of testing we do when we're delivering the daily or the hourly updates to our product. So if you are interested in how our endpoint handles updates, definitely go check out that blog post.
Yep. So at the end of the day, I think we can summarize this as this was an issue of relying on static code validation versus dynamic testing of a change. And CrowdStrike, to be clear, in their blog post, they have already discussed they learned their lesson and they're going to change some of their deployment processes in the future to try and catch some of this. And to be clear, this could and will happen to every software vendor out there. Maybe not to the extent that we saw on the 19th, but bugs happen. Like testing sometimes doesn't catch everything. And
I will
unfortunately
still,
for
yeah.
them, they're catastrophic.
We've seen as simple bugs as a malware update in old AV vendors that have blue screened Windows machines simply because they tried to quarantine a critical Windows. Luckily for some of those cases, they just didn't cause as much global strife as this one. So this does seem like the largest instance I can remember of an AV related bug that crashed Windows from, really affecting everyone. But there have been plenty of other anti-malware bugs that have crashed Windows.
Yep. And this is also, last point, an instance where being more secure ended up causing problems for organizations. Like going back to Delta, only because I'm
Oh
about to
yeah.
hop on a flight again tomorrow. One of the reasons they're struggling so hard to recover is because they followed good data security practices and they deployed BitLocker disk encryption literally everywhere, even their user kiosks to go print out your boarding pass. And unfortunately, because they were using BitLocker, you can't programmatically remotely recover these machines. You have to physically hands-on
Safe
keyboard or
mode.
hands-on virtual keyboard, safe mode, enter in the BitLocker key, and then you can go in and delete that problematic .sys file, the configuration file, and recover.
By the way, Kate,
So
share the story we talked about this morning. Like, another security thing is you should be patching and keeping all your servers up to date. But what was the company that basically had
there
old
was
data? Yeah.
there was one I saw on Twitter that was pretty great, where they said they were saved from this because the first system that got the update was their DNS server, and it went down and broke DNS resolution for their whole organization, which meant none of the other systems could get their updates, and they were all saved.
So by the time they fixed their DNS server, the other systems got the fixed updates. Yeah. So
Yep.
sometimes crashing something else or having an old product that's not affected saves you. That is not an excuse for keeping old products, though. Or
No, not at all. But man, I think this is at least this isn't to throw shade at CrowdStrike. This is something all of us, any software manufacturer, can and should hopefully learn from, even though it caused
yeah.
so much pain to so
And I
many
would say,
organizations.
especially of security-related software manufacturers that have things that run in any kernel mode. Kernel mode is, there are a few instances it's required, but if you're a software creator that doesn't need it, leave it alone. But if you absolutely need it, like if a network driver, or I'm sorry, like a graphics driver could have a bug like this. So everyone in kernel mode should be learning from this.
Yep. So, anyways, let's move on to the next story then. This one was pretty cool. So, I stumbled across this story on like r slash cybersecurity, I think. It was a post by KnowBe4, and the title immediately caught my attention because it's all about how they hired a threat actor from North Korea unknowingly.
Wow.
So they did preface this article with a little paragraph saying that no illegal access was granted, no data was lost, compromised, or exfiltrated, and that the whole point of this article is just to talk about a incident that they had, and so we all can learn from what they learned along the way. So this all started when KnowBe4 wanted to hire a software engineer for their internal IT's artificial intelligence team. They found a qualified individual. HR completed 4 video conference based interviews with them, confirmed that the individual's photo matched what they had on their application, that their background check and everything cleared. They later found out that this is because the individual had stolen someone else's a valid US identity, and they had modified a stock image with artificial intelligence to make it look
Oh,
like them
wow.
and look professional. Um, so either way, they passed all the HR checks. They hired this employee. IT set up their new Mac OS workstation and shipped it out to them. But as soon as that Mac workstation came online, it immediately started trying to load malware. So this all started at 9:55 Eastern on July 15th, when KnowBe4's security operations team detected that anomalous activity. They called up the employee to try and say, hey, what the heck's going on? The SOC already suspected that this was intentional and they might be dealing with an insider threat. The employee responded by saying they were following steps on their router guide to troubleshoot a speed issue, which may have caused the compromise or sketchy activity. Um, Along the way, the attacker was trying to manipulate session history files, transfer potentially harmful files to the machine, and execute unauthorized software. They were using a Raspberry Pi to download malware onto the device. The SOC tried to get more details from them. They tried to get them on a phone call, but he said he was unavailable for a call and then later became unresponsive. And the SOC ended up isolating the system 30 minutes after this started at 10:20 p.m. Eastern on the same day. So they later found that this employee had this North Korean based individual. It had that laptop shipped to what's called an IT mule laptop farm, where they then basically a physical location in the United States where they could then connect with the VPN to access the device remotely and work. They even worked like night shifts in North Korea to make it look like they were in the United States. And it allows them to skirt around I guess, international laws, and in this case, potentially even do work, get paid well, and then give a bunch of money back to the North Korean government to fund their illegal programs. This is pretty nuts, and honestly, this kind of scared the crap out of me when I saw it, because it's tough to. How do you protect against this? Like they passed 4 video interviews with HR, they passed the background check, like everything checked out clear until the SOC caught them doing malicious stuff on their laptop. As no before they had a
Yeah.
couple Go ahead.
I feel like it's very hard to not accidentally hire an employee that's going to that level of faking it for HR. Uh, I would hope if I were know before I would kind of go after the background check though, because if some of their identity was fraudulent, you would assume the background check company could catch it. But other than that, that's hard. I do want to give kudos for like it's going to be impossible to find like there could be legitimate US employees that have bad intentions and they definitely could go through a background check. Maybe it's their first time deciding they want to install ransomware to get a little percentage from some ransomware author, but before they had a clean work history. It's hard to catch those, but to me, the real cool part about this is how quickly the SOC, the fact that they had a SOC, the fact that they had EDR software, the fact that they were monitoring the devices so well of their own trusted users shows that they, at least as an organization, follow some of the best practices, including zero trust practices. I hate to say it because I feel like we trust all our employees at WatchGuard, and so far we're lucky with really good employees. But the whole idea of zero trust is to monitor your own people too, and make sure they have limited privilege. And so I feel like if it wasn't for all the great SOC stuff they're doing, that maybe some businesses aren't, this could have been a really bad situation. So how to stop the bad insider from getting in? That's a question I don't even know how to answer without psychology and better background checks. But as far as how to catch it, I think this is a great use case for how you can catch this type of thing after the fact, at least.
They had some recommendations like better vetting. There were some inconsistencies when they went and looked back at like birthdays that they provided, both in some areas versus other areas, and career inconsistencies as well too. They recommended making sure that people are physically where they're supposed to be, and that like if the laptop shipping address is different from where they live or work, that's a red flag. Look for things like VoIP phone numbers and a lack of digital footprint in contact info versus like a cell phone number that's allocated from T-Mobile or whatever in the US. And then as a technical protection, make sure you don't allow remote access, remoting into devices, remote devices.
Yeah, I agree with all that. By the way, one last thing before we go off it, on my screen, I was showing, it feels very similar to me, something you and I saw. This is an entirely different case, but to show you how big an insider threat issue is and how it may not just be these guys that are faking identities. One of the things Mark and I saw at the FBI CISO Academy that the FBI is trying to push out for people to see is this Made in Beijing, the plan for global market domination. And at the highest level, if you go check out this video, this is a case where an actual Beijing Chinese citizen came to US for schooling, went through schooling for, in this case, I think genetics and agriculture, and got a job at a high-end agriculture, place where they're GMOing different types of plants and stuff, and worked there for 20 years. And literally was just working as an employee that actually was a key employee in some of the stuff that this company did. But meanwhile, for that entire 20 years, they were connected to the Chinese government, and their goal was to actually steal intellectual property, which they were sharing. So, if you're curious about how insidious the insider threat can be, unlike this one, which is one that was kind of identity posing like fraud mixed with a very quick catch, this is one where they actually go through the steps of developing a valid working US identity, but they're still associated with the country that they originally started in decades ago, and they're literally a malicious insider. So recommend it for sure.
Yep. So moving on for the last story, and this is more of a preview of something I'm excited to see at Black Hat this year in just a couple of weeks. Researchers from Wise, I think it's Wiz, published some of their findings last week on what they call tenant isolation research on multiple artificial intelligence service providers. So in the post just this last week, I guess they're going to give a talk at it in Black Hat. It's called Isolation or Hallucination, Hacking AI Infrastructure Providers for Fun and Waits. But in the post this week, they published their vulnerability findings for SAP's artificial intelligence offering called SAP AI Core.
Supponed.
The main takeaways, supponed, yes. The main takeaways were they found vulnerabilities that could let them read and modify Docker images on their internal container registry, modify Docker images on their Google container registry, read and modify artifacts in their Artifactory server for their development pipeline, gain cluster administrative privileges on their AI Core's Kubernetes cluster, and access customers' cloud credentials and private AI artifacts. And I won't go through all the details on this. I'm definitely going to go to their talk in a couple of weeks, and we'll give some more details then. But at a high level, it was really interesting the path they took to escape out of this system. So SAP lets customers run their artificial intelligence projects as a Kubernetes pod in a container or a cluster that SAP manages. Those containers are restricted by default. In fact, network access control is controlled by something called Istio, which is like a meshing network extension for Kubernetes. Containers aren't allowed to run as root, for example. But the first thing they found was that you can have your container run as any user ID on that system. And while you couldn't run as root, you could run as Istio's user ID, which then let them run as that user and bypass the network protection rules they had, which basically opened the door into the entire virtual Kubernetes network. So they started scanning the pod's internal network. They found things like a Grafana Loki instance that exposed AWS authentication tokens. They found other customers' pods were exposing Elastic File System, EFS shares, which allowed them to read sensitive files from those customer devices. They found the Helm package manager for this Kubernetes cluster was unauthenticated, which let them query and pull credentials out of that Helm server, including credentials read and write for their Docker registry and their Artifactory server. They found exposed secrets from SAP's beyond their AI core, things like their AWS credentials, data lake access, Docker Hub. So from allowing customers to run their own containers in something you think you control, one mistake, one chink in that armor allowed them to basically gain access and visibility into the entire system. It was pretty nuts reading through
It's
that
scary.
article.
And as we consider to try to figure out the security risks with these AI models, one of the things we're asking people to look for is if you pay for something, at least you get your own tenant. But the whole point of this is it looks like AI is so nascent and is evolving so quickly that we're building systems that have mistakes where your own tenant may not be as secure as you think it is, essentially.
So this was one example. They supposedly researched a ton of different organizations and AI providers. I am very much looking forward to this talk
That'd be a
at
good
Black Hat
one.
this year, and we'll include it on one of our recap episodes. But man, like I said, I got a flight home to Austin in about 24 hours as we're recording this. I sure as heck hope that there isn't another catastrophic IT issue that causes that one delayed as well too. What a crazy, crazy week this last week was.
It was fun.
You and I have different definitions of fun.
Or you just didn't catch my sarcasm on the fun.
Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Instagram at watchguard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week. Why are you thumbs downing?
I was saying yes to thumbs up, no to thumbs down.
Okay, got it.
You rate us how you want, but Mark will send a beer to everyone that gives us 5 stars.
I'm expensing those beers.